Please allow me to put the tip. The mountain man begged his virgin wife. In the rugged wilderness of Montana Territory, 1887, a reclusive mountain man named Elias Thorn lives a solitary life after years of hardship and betrayal. When a young, innocent woman named Clara Whitmore, a runaway mail-order bride, collapses near his cabin during a blizzard, fate forces them together. Bound by circumstance and need, their uneasy companionship blossoms into love. But for Clara, who has never known kindness, and Elias, who fears breaking what's fragile, learning to love each other will take courage far greater than surviving the mountain. Now let the story begin. The Montana wind howled across the mountains like a wild beast, carrying snow in furious swirls that bit through even the thickest coat. Elias Thorn trudged through the knee-deep drifts, his leather boots crunching against the frozen ground. The trail was barely visible, but he had to check on his mule, Storm, before returning to the cabin. The mountains were unforgiving, and one misstep could mean death. As he rounded a bend, something unusual caught his eye, a pale shape, almost hidden beneath a fallen pine. Squinting against the snow, Elias froze. It was a woman, her bonnet torn and face streaked with frostbite. She was trembling violently, half buried in snow, and her shallow breathing was ragged. His heart thudded, not just at the sight, but because he recognized the same helplessness in her eyes that he had seen in the dying faces of strangers lost in the mountains. Without a second thought, he dropped to his knees and scooped her up. She was light, fragile, and completely vulnerable. "Hold on," he muttered, his deep voice almost swallowed by the wind. "You're going to be fine." Carrying her back to his cabin was a trial. Snow clung to his beard, icy flakes stung his cheeks, and the wind tore at his cloak. But he never let go. Each step was measured, careful, because the last thing he wanted was to lose her now. When he finally reached his cabin, he brushed the snow from her hair and shoulders. The fire inside flickered, sending dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. Elias laid her on a bed of furs, pulling his own coat over her to warm her. "Name?" he asked gently, knowing she might not respond. Her lips trembled. "Clara Whitmore." He nodded once as if confirming a prayer. Clara Whitmore. A name now tethered to a life he was determined to save. The night stretched long and quiet. Elias stoked the fire repeatedly, fetched water, and tried to keep her warm without waking her. He had lived in these mountains for over 20 years, surviving frost, wolves, and men with cruel hearts, but nothing had stirred him like this fragile stranger in his cabin. Hours passed. Clara's breathing slowly steadied, and when dawn finally crept over the ridges, Elias found her eyes fluttering open. She looked around, disoriented, her lips parting in a faint, fragile smile. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I did," Elias said simply. He didn't know why he felt a twinge of pride or why the sight of her alive made his chest ache with something unfamiliar, something like hope. Clara tried to sit, shivering. Elias gently pressed her back down. "Rest. You're safe now. There's nothing out there that'll touch you," he said firmly, though he didn't know how true that would be. In these mountains, safety was never guaranteed, but in his cabin, with him standing guard, she would have a fighting chance. For the first time in years, Elias Thorn felt the stirrings of a bond, not just a duty to protect, but a desire to nurture, to be close, to watch over someone whose life had been all but lost. And as the morning light filtered through the frost-coated windows, he realized something he hadn't dared admit. The mountain, harsh and unforgiving as it was, had just brought him something precious, a life worth caring for. The storm had passed, but the real test, their first steps toward trust and survival together, was only beginning. The blizzard had passed, but the mountains remained harsh and unyielding. Snow drifts stretched like white seas around Elias Thorn's cabin. The pines weighed heavy with ice. Inside, the fire burned bright, sending warmth into every corner of the small log-walled room. Clara Whitmore sat on the edge of the fur-covered bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She still trembled, not from cold but from the sheer strangeness of her new reality. Elias moved about the cabin with practiced ease, bringing a pot of stew to the table. He had learned long ago how to survive in these mountains, and survival meant routine. Food, fire, tools, shelter. Everything had a purpose. But now, for the first time in decades, he had another life to consider. Another person to protect. "You should eat," he said gruffly, setting the bowl in front of her. The warmth from the clay pot radiated against the chill in her fingers. I couldn't take your food," Clara whispered, embarrassed. Her pride was intact despite exhaustion and frost-bitten fingers. "I'm a stranger here. You've already done too much." Elias shook his head, kneeling slightly to meet her gaze. His dark eyes were steady, firm. "You're not a burden. You're alive. That's reason enough." She hesitated, then lifted the spoon. The aroma of the stew was simple, earthy, wild game, root vegetables, herbs, but to Clara, it tasted like warmth, like safety. She ate slowly, afraid of taking too much, afraid of trusting. Days stretched into routine. Clara helped as she could, gathering kindling, fetching water from the nearby stream, and mending his worn clothes. Elias watched her carefully, guiding her hands with rough gentleness when necessary, but never touching her without permission. He was patient, precise, and something about his restraint made her heart flutter with unfamiliar emotions. For Elias, every glance he stole at Clara was a careful battle with his own instincts. He had lived alone for decades, building walls higher than the mountains themselves. Yet her presence chipped away at them piece by piece. One morning, as sunlight glinted off the snow, Clara attempted to repair a tear in his jacket. Her fingers fumbled with the coarse thread and she sighed in frustration. "Let me," Elias said, kneeling beside her. His hands hovered over hers for a moment before he carefully guided the needle. Clara felt her breath catch, not from fear but from the closeness, the warmth radiating from him. "You're gentle," she murmured, eyes wide. Elias grunted softly, not used to compliments, especially not from someone so fragile yet brave. "Gentle don't get you far in the mountains," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. She didn't notice the slight tremor in his fingers. Evenings were quieter. They shared meals by the fire, talking softly about trivial things, how to mend a broken trap, the tracks of a wolf, or the weather. Clara learned the rhythm of his life and he learned hers. Words were few but their presence spoke volumes. Yet there was an unspoken tension between them. Clara often caught him staring, a distant intensity in his eyes, and Elias sometimes caught her lingering glances, quick and shy. Neither dared to cross the invisible line. For Clara, it was fear of the unknown. For Elias, it was fear of breaking what he didn't yet understand, this fragile trust. One night, she whispered as she laid out her bedding by the fire, I don't want to intrude." Elias shook his head. "You're not intruding. You're alive. That's all that matters." Clara looked up at him, her eyes soft and uncertain. For the first time, Elias realized he didn't just want her safe, he wanted her near. But he wasn't ready to admit it, not even to himself. Outside, the wind howled against the cabin walls, a reminder that the mountains were merciless. Inside, however, a quiet warmth grew between them, fragile and unspoken, like the first green shoots of spring breaking through snow. And both knew, deep in their hearts, that life would never be the same again. The first thaw of spring crept slowly over the Montana mountains. Snow softened to slush along the paths, and the air smelled faintly of pine and wet earth. Inside Elias Thorn's cabin, warmth filled the small space, but Clara Whitmore still carried a chill that no fire could chase away, one that came from memories she had buried deep. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped tightly, staring at the rough wooden floorboards. Every so often, she flinched at a creak or a gust rattling the window panes. Elias noticed but said nothing at first. He understood that trust, like the mountains themselves, was built stone by stone. Finally, as he repaired a broken chair, she spoke, her voice low and trembling. I should tell you something." Elias paused, wiping sawdust from his hands. His gaze was steady, but a sharp edge ran beneath it, an alertness honed by years alone. "You don't have to," he said quietly, though he knew better. He could feel the weight she carried pressing through the walls of the cabin. Clara swallowed hard, her eyes downcast. "The man I was supposed to marry, he was cruel. He didn't care who I was, only that I obeyed him. I ran but he tried to track me. I thought he would." Her voice broke and she clenched her fists to stop the trembling. Elias's jaw tightened. For years he had fought wolves, snowstorms and thieves, but nothing had made his blood boil faster than the thought of someone harming this fragile woman who now sat before him. "You ran from him," he said, his voice low, measured. "And you're here. That's what matters." She lifted her face, tears pooling in her eyes. For the first time she allowed herself to hope, not just for survival but for safety. I've never had anyone protect me before. I don't know how to be safe." Elias knelt before her, keeping his hands to himself but letting his presence fill the space between them. "You don't have to know yet. You'll learn. And I'll make sure no man, no one, ever lays a hand on you that doesn't belong there." Clara's tears spilled over, hot and sudden. She buried her face in her hands, trembling in a mixture of fear, relief, and exhaustion. Elias remained silent, letting her cry, understanding that sometimes words only disturbed what needed quiet. When her sobs finally subsided, she looked up at him, gratitude and something deeper shining in her eyes. You're not like him. No, he said simply. I'm not. And I never will be. Not with you. A long silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken thoughts. Clara realized she could breathe here, truly breathe, for the first time in years. Elias realized he could care for someone without the constant fear of losing them, and the thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. That evening, as the wind rattled against the cabin, they shared a meal in quiet companionship. Their conversation was minimal, but every glance carried weight. Clara learned to anticipate Elias's needs, and Elias learned to read the subtle shifts in her mood. They began to move together in a rhythm, small, careful, but undeniably theirs. As Clara cleaned the hearth and Elias stacked firewood, he caught her hand in his for the briefest moment, a touch meant to steady her, not to claim her. She didn't pull away and neither did he. It was in that simple, fleeting touch that something unspoken passed between them. Protection. Trust. Perhaps the beginnings of love. Outside, the mountains were still merciless, but inside the cabin, two hearts began to heal, cautiously and carefully. Both understood that the road ahead would be difficult. Both understood that the past had scars that would not fade easily. But for the first time, Clara and Elias were not facing the wilderness alone. Spring had arrived in small, hesitant steps. The snow was melting, revealing the rough, rocky terrain beneath, and the mountain air was tinged with the scent of pine, wet earth, and the faint sweetness of early blooms. Inside Elias Thorn's cabin, warmth from the fire cast flickering shadows across the walls, and for the first time, the space felt alive with more than just survival. It held possibility. Clara had begun to move more freely around the cabin. She carried water, prepared meals, and tended the small indoor herbs Elias had taught her to grow. Yet, no matter how strong she appeared, there were moments when her frailty showed, moments that made Elias's chest tighten in ways he hadn't felt in decades. That night, a distant thunderstorm rolled across the valley. Rain and sleet lashed against the cabin roof, and the wind howled through the cracks in the log walls. Clara awoke with a start, her heart pounding, a nightmare still lingering on her skin. She shivered violently, wrapped herself in a blanket, and whispered into the dark, "No, please no." Elias, already awake from the sound of her tossing and turning, was at her side in an instant. He knelt beside the bed, brushing her hair gently from her face. His fingers hovered for a moment, almost trembling, not from fear but from a surge of emotion he had fought to suppress. "Clara," he said softly, his deep voice low and steady against the roar of the storm. "It's all right. You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you." Her wide eyes met his, glistening with fear and relief. She opened her mouth to speak but could only manage a faint whisper. I can't. Elias's hand twitched as if to reach for her, to draw her close and hold her until the nightmare passed. But he stopped himself. He had promised restraint. He had promised patience. And the fear of pushing too far too soon kept him rooted where he was. Instead, he leaned slightly closer, careful to respect her boundaries. "Breathe," he said quietly. "Just breathe. I'm right here." Clara followed his instruction, her chest rising and falling slowly as she struggled to calm her racing heart. The firelight danced across their faces, illuminating the raw honesty in their gazes. In that fragile moment, trust was being built, not with words but with presence. Finally, she managed a small, trembling smile. "Thank you," she whispered, "for staying." Elias exhaled, his own tension loosening slightly. "Always," he said simply. "I won't leave. Not now, not ever." They sat in silence for a while, the storm outside a distant roar compared to the quiet intensity in the cabin. Neither moved, neither spoke. The unspoken tension between them pulsed like the firelight, an invisible thread connecting their hearts. For Elias, the desire to hold her, to comfort her fully, gnawed at him. For Clara, the vulnerability of needing someone to lean on scared her, yet a part of her longed to surrender to it. Both understood the delicate balance. Too much too soon could shatter the fragile trust between them. As the thunder rumbled away and the storm began to wane, Clara finally drifted into a light, peaceful sleep. Elias stayed beside her a little longer, watching the rise and fall of her chest. His hand twitched again, closer this time, almost touching hers. But he refrained, letting the moment pass, storing it away for another night when perhaps the fear and hesitation would have faded enough for them both. Outside, the mountains remained wild and unforgiving. Inside, however, a small miracle had occurred. Two souls, battered by pasts and fears, had inched closer together, cautiously, patiently, and with the beginnings of a connection neither of them could deny. And for Elias Thorn that was more than enough for one night. The thaw had brought life back to the mountains, trickling streams, budding pine needles, and the faint hum of distant birds. But with spring also came reminders that the world outside the cabin was never forgiving. Clara had begun to feel safer, perhaps too safe, when the past she had tried to outrun came riding up the valley road like a storm she couldn't escape. It was late afternoon when the sound of hooves broke the quiet. Clara, gathering firewood, froze. Her hands shook and the color drained from her cheeks. Elias, standing at the cabin door, caught the subtle change in her posture immediately. "Who is it?" she whispered, barely moving her lips. He didn't answer at first. His eyes narrowed, scanning the ridge where 3 riders were approaching. The tallest among them wore the unmistakable swagger of someone used to command and cruelty. His broad-brimmed hat cast a shadow over a hard, scowling face. Clara's breath hitched. "Harlan Briggs," she whispered. Elias's jaw clenched. Harlan Briggs, the man she had fled, the man who had intended to treat her as nothing more than property. He had been relentless, and now he had tracked her to the mountains. Elias stepped outside, his shotgun ready. The riders slowed as they approached, the snow crunching beneath their horses' hooves. Briggs dismounted first, a smirk curling across his face as he saw Clara standing near the cabin, the firelight glinting on her pale face. "Looks like the little bride found herself a hideout," Briggs sneered. "Thought you could run, did you? Thought you could hide from me?" Clara's hands clenched into fists. Fear and anger mingled, making her tremble. She took a small step back toward the cabin. Elias didn't flinch. His deep voice rolled over the snow and wind like a low thunderclap. "She belongs to no one." Briggs laughed, sharp and cruel. "Not anyone? Then I guess I'll have to remind you of your place." He reached for his gun. Time seemed to stretch. Elias's eyes locked on Briggs, measuring every movement, every muscle, every hint of intent. Then, with a speed that belied his size, Elias fired. The sharp crack of the shotgun echoed across the valley. Briggs went down, the snow erupting around him. The other 2 riders froze, fear flashing across their faces, before they quickly mounted and rode off, leaving their leader behind. Clara gasped, running to Elias's side. "Are you?" "Fine," he said gruffly, though his chest heaved with adrenaline. "He won't be following you anymore." Her tears spilled over as she clung to him, burying her face in his coat. For the first time she felt utterly safe, completely and unconditionally. Elias's arms wrapped around her briefly, holding her just enough to let her feel the protection she had longed for, but not too much to rush the fragile trust they had built. "You could have been hurt," she whispered, voice trembling. "I'd rather face 100 Briggs than let him lay a finger on you," Elias said softly. His voice, usually rough and guarded, carried warmth and an edge of emotion that surprised even him. The fire crackled inside the cabin as they returned, shadows dancing over their tense faces. Outside, the mountains were silent once more, the threat gone, for now. But inside, the bond between them had deepened, forged in the heat of danger. Clara realized that Elias wasn't just a protector. He was someone who would fight for her life and her freedom, no matter the cost. That night, as Clara lay in her bed of furs, she traced the lines of her hands and realized she felt a strange mixture of fear, awe, and an almost dizzying gratitude for the man who had saved her again. She closed her eyes, listening to the steady rhythm of Elias's breathing as he stood watch by the window. And though she didn't say it aloud, she knew this. The mountains could throw whatever storms they wanted at her, but with Elias Thorn she would never face them alone. The first light of morning painted the Montana mountains in soft hues of gold and pink. Snowmelt trickled down rocky slopes, the air fresh and crisp with the scent of pine and earth. The storm from the night before had passed, leaving the world quiet except for the occasional chirp of a returning bird. Inside the cabin, Clara stirred, the events of the previous day settling heavily in her mind. She had survived the arrival of Harlan Briggs and his posse, thanks to Elias's quick thinking and unwavering protection. But more than survival, she felt a new, profound sense of safety, one she hadn't known in years. Elias had spent the night sitting by the window, shotgun resting against the logs, his sharp eyes scanning the ridges for any sign of danger. He had barely slept, his mind on Clara, on the man who had dared to threaten her, and on the unspoken feelings he had yet to voice. When Clara finally joined him for breakfast, she noticed a calmness in the cabin, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous night. Elias moved quietly, preparing their simple meal, but the intensity in his eyes remained. I can't thank you enough, Clara said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice carried a mixture of awe, relief, and something deeper, more vulnerable. You don't have to, Elias replied, not looking at her directly. Actions speak louder than words. You're alive. That's enough for me. After breakfast, the sheriff arrived, a stern man with an understanding nod. He had investigated the shooting and listened carefully to Clara's testimony. His verdict was swift: self-defense. Harlan Briggs had been threatening, armed, and clearly the aggressor. Elias had acted to protect a life, and in the eyes of the law, that life was Clara's. Clara exhaled a long, shaky breath, tears welling in her eyes. For the first time in her life she felt free. Free from the shadow of her past, free from fear, and free to simply exist in a world where someone cared enough to protect her. Later, as the day waned and the sun sank behind the mountains, Clara found herself sitting by the fire, her hands clasped nervously. Elias watched her from across the cabin, silent but present. I don't want to be a burden anymore, she whispered, voice almost lost in the crackle of the fire. I want to be yours if you'll have me. Elias froze, caught off guard by the depth of her words. He took a step toward her, then stopped, wrestling with the intensity of his own emotions. Claire, I've promised to be patient, he said, voice low but earnest. I'll never ask for more than you can give. She met his gaze, eyes shining with trust and longing. Then let me give what I choose. A moment of silence stretched between them, the weight of unspoken promises and emotions thick in the air. Elias finally closed the distance, kneeling beside her and taking her hands in his. His thumb brushed lightly over her knuckles, and Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest, a comfort she had never known before. You've no idea what it means to me, he murmured, his voice catching slightly. To see you alive, safe, to know I can protect you. Clara smiled through her tears, leaning just slightly into him. Then let me stay, she whispered. With you. Elias's hand tightened gently around hers. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, hesitating just long enough to savor the moment. Always, he said. You'll stay. No matter what. Outside, the mountains remained silent, the danger gone, but inside the cabin, a quiet miracle had occurred. Trust, once fragile, had taken root. Fear had begun to dissolve, replaced by something stronger. Love, tentative but undeniable, taking its first steps into a world they would now face together. That night, as the fire crackled and the shadows danced across the log walls, Clara drifted into sleep knowing she was safe, cherished, and finally home. Elias watched over her, a quiet smile on his face, the weight of years of solitude lifting with the warmth of her presence. For the first time in decades he allowed himself to hope, not just for survival but for the life they could share together. Spring had fully arrived in the valley. The snow had melted into rushing streams and the mountains, once stark and intimidating, now glowed with fresh green and the bright colors of wildflowers peeking through the earth. Birds chirped, and the gentle hum of life returning to the wilderness filled the air. The world outside had softened, but the true warmth was found inside the cabin. Clara stepped outside, sunlight dancing across her hair, tending to a small garden Elias had helped her plant. Rows of herbs, lettuce and wildflowers thrived in the rocky soil. Each tiny sprout seemed to symbolize their fragile but growing life together. She worked slowly, savoring the peace, her mind occasionally drifting to Elias. He watched from the cabin doorway, leaning on the wooden frame. His dark eyes softened as he observed her, the careful way she tended the plants, the subtle smile she offered to herself, and the quiet confidence that had begun to grow in her. The man who had once lived in solitude and suspicion now found himself drawn, wholly and irreversibly, to the woman who had taught him patience, trust, and hope. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the cabin and the garden. Elias walked toward her, boots crunching softly on the thawed earth. He stopped a few feet away, studying her with a mix of admiration and something deeper, something that made his chest ache. Clara, he said quietly, his voice carrying over the gentle hum of the valley. She looked up, cheeks flushed, a small smile playing on her lips. Yes. He took another step, closing the distance, his gaze never leaving hers. I begged God for peace, he said, voice low but steady, and he sent me you. I've spent years alone, thinking no one could ever belong to me, but now I know I was wrong. Her hands instinctively reached for his, fingers brushing against his calloused palms. And, you belong to me? She asked softly, eyes shimmering with hope. Elias swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the mountains, the dangers, and the hardships they had endured together. He knelt before her slightly, not out of submission but as a gesture of reverence. "I belong to you if you'll have me. Please, allow me to love you." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. She stepped closer, closing the remaining space between them. "I do," she whispered, her voice steady, certain. "I've been waiting to hear you say that, and I've been hoping for it every day." For a long moment they stood there, hands intertwined, hearts beating in quiet harmony. The mountains, once a symbol of isolation and hardship, seemed to hold their breath with them. Then, slowly, Elias bent his forehead to hers, eyes closing, savoring the closeness he had longed for without rushing, without breaking the fragile trust they had built. Clara rested her cheek against his, letting the warmth of his presence fill every corner of her soul. She had feared the mountains, feared men, feared the unknown, but she no longer feared the future because Elias Thorn was there. The evening sun bathed the cabin in golden light, shadows dancing across the walls as the fire crackled softly inside. Outside, the valley echoed with the peaceful sounds of spring, but within the cabin, a new life was beginning. One of shared trust, respect, and a love that had survived the harshest tests. Elias brushed a strand of hair from her face, smiling for the first time without restraint. "We'll face whatever comes together," he murmured. Clara smiled back, squeezing his hands gently. "Together?" she echoed. And for the first time in years, neither the mountain nor the wilderness could touch them, not because danger had disappeared, but because they had found something stronger: each other. The fire crackled, the shadows danced, and two hearts, once broken by fear and solitude, beat as one. In that small cabin, nestled against the Montana mountains, love had finally found its home.